Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'll just give you a few moments to settle in and for people to jump into the session, and encourage you to jump into the chat and say hello, perhaps where you're joining us from today. We'll start shortly. This session is being recorded, and we will be following up today with a detailed guide of the content, so you can come back to it later. So there's no great need to scribe lots of notes. Please, enjoy the time and perhaps eat your lunch and sit back and take in this wisdom. Hi, Ellen, welcome. Yes, all right, we might get started. So today's session that you're joining us for is on radical compliance in advertising, very graciously hosted with our B Corp partners at Marque Lawyers. And this is a topic in a series that we're planning to roll out on storytelling for B Corps. We do get a lot of questions and queries, and there's a lot of attention on greenwashing at the moment. So we felt it was a timely conversation to have, and a good opportunity to share the expertise from our community and have a conversation with you all. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. So I'm joining you from Wurundjeri country. We're Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, acknowledging that sovereignty was never ceded. And also, for anyone who's joining us from Aotearoa, New Zealand, pay my respects to the First Peoples of those lands too. We're currently, this is a beautiful image from the Moreland Primary School curriculum, which reflects the Wurundjeri seasons, and we're currently on the cusp of a new one. So when paying attention to the lands, you may have noticed wattle emerging lately, and we're shortly moving into the season, which is more of a tadpole season. So look out for those as the weather starts to warm up. And so introducing today, acknowledging the contributions as well from our team here at Marque Lawyers, I'd like to introduce you to Hannah and Danny.
Hello.
And feel free to say hi, Hannah and Danny. Yes, so Marque Lawyers is a B Corp firm, and they're experienced and specialised in the Competition and Consumer Act, which we're going to unpack a little bit today. And in particular, Hannah is ruthless when it comes to understanding and guiding clients on what greenwashing looks like and how to avoid it. So we're going to hear from Hannah today, and Danny as well, who has definitely got a strong background in regulatory regimes, and some pretty impressive credibility around being awarded a distinction in the International Legal Studies at New York University, and has published lots of articles in legal publications as well. So we're in very good hands today, and I'm going to pass over to Hannah and Danny to step you through the presentation. We will have some time for questions at the end, so please do submit those in the question section, and we'll talk about those towards the end. Thanks, Hannah and Danny.
Thank you, Angie, and thanks, Kira, as well, for your help in setting up today. Danny and I are coming to you live from Gadigal country, and we would also like to share our respect with elders past and present and any First Nations people here today. What we want to speak about with the group today is this concept of radical compliance, which starts with the legal rules around misleading advertising and greenwashing, and then elevates beyond that to this cool opportunity for B Corps with a strong understanding of the legal framework to step beyond that and to step off that platform to drive for radical impact and radical change with the way that you frame your marketing communications, and the stories that you choose to tell. So we're super pleased to be here, and we will kick off because there's a fair bit to cover. We'll have some question time at the end, and we love questions, so please hit us up. So first of all, I think I'd like to start with what is greenwashing? What does greenwashing look like? The first example is a case that just got launched recently about these Go Neutral claims by Energy Australia. The Australian Parents for Climate Action have launched proceedings. It's quite a cool idea. Basically what they're saying is that carbon neutral or Go Neutral claims assume an equivalency between the negative impact of the carbon emissions and the positive impact of the offsets being applied. And they're challenging that and saying you can't assume that equivalency because of the very wide range and quality of the different kind of offsets being used. So we're really keen to see how this case plays out. It's a very cool argument, and it could have big impacts for the way people use and speak about offsetting. Oh, Kourtney Kardashian and boohoo. This one was a bit painful to look at. It's kind of like a train wreck. You want to look, but you don't. So boohoo cooked up this really great idea of appointing Kourtney Kardashian as their sustainability ambassador. They also had her design a sustainable range, which had, I can't remember the number, I think kind of 20 to 30 items in it, which they claimed were sustainable, but they made no mention of the other 40,000 items they produce every year, which aren't sustainable. So for this effort, they earned terrible reputational backlash and an investigation in the UK by their Competition and Consumer Regulator, which is also ongoing, but that one was a big old mess. Santos is also facing a local court action brought by an activist group, much like Energy Australia. They reported on a net zero by 2040 plan, which relies on highly questionable carbon capture and storage, and at the same time included plans to massively expand their extraction of fossil fuels over time. So the underlying net zero claim has been challenged on the basis of being misleading. Also under challenge are their claims around clean energy associated with gas and blue hydrogen. So again, this one's ongoing. It's a good one to watch, where some of those common claims, like net zero claims, will be tested and addressed by the courts. I like this example because of the slide which will follow. This one is about HSBC promoting that it's investing in the future of the Great Barrier Reef. And look at those cute little clownfish, isn't that great? What's actually going on behind the scenes is, yes, they are giving money towards protection of the Great Barrier Reef. However, they're also giving money to Adani, who are obviously destroying the Great Barrier Reef. So for their efforts, they earned this piece of guerrilla advertising, which I love, which was put up in London in particular, around the COP conference there. And yeah, they've kind of, pulled the lid on the claims by HSBC. So they haven't faced legal action over that, but they have obviously faced huge reputational backlash. So that's the what. I think particularly for B Corps and the group here today, it's really, really important to think about, why does this matter? And why is understanding greenwashing, the risk and the opportunity it presents, particularly relevant for B Corps? Obviously the aim is to avoid greenwashing and misleading advertising. That's a given. But looking a little beyond that is actually really critical for setting priorities and aligning your risk appetite with your business's purpose and your commitments as a B Corp. And there's a few answers when you look at it in this way. Obviously the start point is legal compliance. You need to know what the law is. You need to know how to not break it. Greenwashing is a major regulatory focus for both ASIC and the ACCC at the moment. They are undoubtedly on the hunt for prosecutions. ASIC has already commenced a couple. The priority one for every business, including B Corps, is to not be a test case. So that's kind of the baseline, the start point. Next, for purpose-driven businesses, for B Corps, for you guys, for us, we hold ourselves to a higher standard. Transparency, trustworthiness, compliance, those are all fundamental building blocks for businesses like ours. Without these in place, we can't take up the role that we want to play in shaping our society. The purpose is meaningless without compliance. And so that's why this topic and this issue is particularly relevant for B Corps and purpose-driven businesses. There's even more to it than that, though, and this is where things get radical. The opportunity is to raise the bar for your industry with the way that you communicate. You know, you can educate consumers, you can use your platform to press for the kinds of change that your business wants to drive. And to do that most successfully, you need a strong compliance base, because if people start looking back at you for being loud, you know, you need to be on safe grounding. Another thing we've observed, particularly working with our B Corp clients, there's two things, I suppose. The first is the rise of conscious consumers. And what that means is we're seeing a convergence between legally robust marketing content, storytelling, and impactful marketing content and storytelling, which is really cool, because in the past the two haven't always aligned comfortably, but that's where things are at now, because consumers disbelieve the quick blush stories, they disbelieve Kourtney Kardashian, and they want a bit more information and a bit more detail. And legally robust claims have the same thing. Typically, they have a bit more detail, a bit more explanation, a bit more transparency embedded in them. And so that's a really cool opportunity for B Corps to leverage. The other thing we have seen is clients with really legitimate environmental credentials making risky claims through inadvertence or misunderstanding of how the legal principles work. That's addressable. You know, that doesn't need to happen. That's not a risk that businesses like ours need to take. So that's another area where we really love helping readjust and realign B Corps and purpose-driven businesses to allow them to tell their stories in a really powerful way.
Coming back to regulation and compliance, the fun part, we're very serious when we say this is a regulatory focus. It is on the radar at the moment. For every business that we're working with, the current aim is really to stay off of the radar of the regulator and not be a priority for ASIC or for the ACCC. Earlier this year, the ACCC actually did its own internet sweep to have a look for greenwashing claims online, and it had a look at 247 different businesses. As part of that sweep, it found that 57% of the claims were potentially misleading, and it was going to move to investigate them. It found that the sectors that had the biggest proportion of potentially misleading claims were textiles, garments and shoes, cosmetics and personal care, food and beverages. They also release a list of their priorities every year, and I can confirm the ACCC has put greenwashing right at the top of that list again. In July, they also released their guidance document on greenwashing, focusing on 8 principles that are designed to help businesses avoid greenwashing. Similarly, ASIC has also been taking a big focus on greenwashing. And in June 2022, so last year, they released guidance on greenwashing for finance products. And they've actually increased their enforcement action, including commencing proceedings in 3 cases, as well as other enforcement action on the way up to that. So it's very much on the regulator's mind right now. And as Hannah said, they're looking for prosecutions. But the flip side, the positive part, is that there's also a huge opportunity for robust advertising to have a positive impact on environmental outcomes. So this opportunity is very well suited for B Corps. Advertising has the power to impact behaviour. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported several ways that advertising can positively influence environmental outcomes. So one is that advertising can communicate changes in social norms. So in the context of environmental claims, this can actually help to accelerate positive behaviour change. So consumers are choosing the more environmentally sound option. Another one is that providing information to consumers engages their desire to contribute to the social good. An example of this is energy efficient labels. Another is impact reporting, showing consumers the value of their choices. It's arming them with the information they need to be able to make decisions. Information supplied to target groups, so your customers, by trusted role models like industry leaders or influencers, is also a means of facilitating better climate change knowledge. So in this session, we'll talk about harnessing this opportunity to build brand value and play a part in creating positive change. We also want to give you the tools to identify legally risky claims and be able to fix them. So that's the what.
now you know what greenwashing is, and you know what the regulators are doing and what the opportunity is. I think now it's probably worthwhile starting to talk about the how. So that means understanding the law and how it applies to greenwashing and environmental claims. So the law is pretty simple. Basically, it says don't be misleading. The Australian Consumer Law, the ASIC Act and the Corps Act each have general prohibitions on misleading or deceptive conduct. And they basically operate at the level of principle. They don't have black and white rules to follow, but there are some guidelines based on the court cases. And as you've seen, ASIC and the ACCC have released regulatory guidance, which doesn't operate to say what the law is, but it gives you a big heads up on how they interpret the law and the kinds of claims that they'll be looking at and scrutinising for potential enforcement actions. So greenwashing is basically just a kind of misleading or deceptive conduct, as the maker of the claim is misleading their audience as to the environmental benefit or the properties of a product or service. So deciding whether something is greenwashing, whether it's legally risky, involves applying the legal principles which are developed around misleading or deceptive conduct more generally, and misleading advertising more generally as a subset of misleading or deceptive conduct. Before we start to dig further into the principles, I will say a word on penalties. It's not the idea of this session to scare you terribly, but you kind of need to know, and frankly, it is a little bit scary, so I can't leave it out. Penalties are massive, and maximums now start from 50 million per contravention, which is going to produce a very rapid climb in the level of penalties that we're seeing, because in most cases there are multiple contraventions, so you'll get multiple times the penalty. Trivago recently paid a $54 million penalty for misleading advertising claims. That was based on the old maximum penalty, which started at 10 million. So we've gone up by a factor of 5. This is a big business risk. The ACCC can also obtain in court enforceable undertakings, requires you to implement compliance programs, corrective advertising, and issue no admission spot fines. If you get investigated, they are risky, time-consuming, a drain on your business, and frankly expensive when you go and get the kind of legal advice you need to navigate that process. They are best avoided, which I'm sure you can understand. You can also face private action from competitors or consumers. The cases against Santos and Energy Australia are recent examples of that. There are a heap more overseas as well. I think there's been a class action launched in the US against Delta Airlines as well, based on their carbon neutral claims and net zero claims. So that kind of private litigation action is definitely on the rise as well. Lastly, and particularly relevant for B Corps, don't forget reputational damage. Potentially for a purpose-led business, damage around your honesty and trustworthiness is potentially even more damaging than a court award. You think about how things go viral, the Kourtney Kardashian example, and the rise of cancel culture. For B Corps, it's so important to uphold and perform the practices that we say we have adhered to, and that we've shown that we have adhered to by obtaining B Corp certification.
Which leads into the principles. So what are the rules around misleading or deceptive conduct? And the first thing to think about is whether content is misleading is assessed by looking at the overall impression of the content. So this is the combined effect of graphics, text, even the layout. So the use of environmental pictures or images might actually suggest environmental benefits or advantages to the customer, even in the absence of any written claim saying that, and that could be misleading. There are lots of examples of businesses combining individual elements, which might all be technically accurate in their own right, but combining it in a way that creates an impression that's overall misleading. So that's important to keep in mind. The second thing is that the relevant test is whether the conduct was objectively misleading or deceptive, or likely to mislead or deceive. So this considers the likely effect of the conduct on the ordinary and reasonable members of the group of people that might be misled or deceived, which are the people that are seeing the advertising. So it's thinking about the ordinary and reasonable member of that test group. And I think Hannah might speak a little bit about that in a case example coming up, so I won't steal that thunder. Another thing, and you see this a lot, intention is irrelevant. So you don't actually need to intend to be misleading or deceptive. It's an objective test. And silence itself can be misleading. So omitting key information can be misleading by itself. So these are the principles that apply to greenwashing and advertising generally. There are no specific laws that just address greenwashing. So understanding how the misleading or deceptive principles work in practice will actually help with understanding how to avoid being misleading, including by greenwashing. And the best start point is a case example, which I will let Hannah take.
So on the screen now, we've got the example of an ad from a case which went all the way up to the High Court, which for we lawyers is very exciting. We get wound up about these things. We want to see all the judgments, the dissenting judgments. It's very exciting. But for you guys, what it means is this is probably one of the most clearest statements of how the law applies to advertising in terms of whether it's misleading. So you can see on the ad, it's a terrible picture, I apologise. It was a TV ad, and it was on TV getting on for 10 years ago now, I think. It's pretty old, that's why it's pretty crappy in terms of its quality. But, you know, you're watching TV, maybe you're eating some Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and this flashes up on your screen for 2 seconds. And you think about, you know, what are you going to get from that in those 2 seconds? What the court said was, all any reasonable person is going to get from that in 2 seconds is that there's an offer for unlimited ADSL for $29.99 per month. There's some fine print under that, which no one's really going to catch the detail of. And so this is an example from which the court derived the principle of the overall impression or the dominant thrust of an ad. And what they say is, your normal audience isn't going to give this really close attention. They're just going to get a quick snapshot and just take the gist of it, the vibe of it. And that's all you can expect of them, which is interesting because if you dig into the fine print, in fact, every piece of information on this ad is accurate. You know, the offer was $29.99 per month for unlimited ADSL. The minimum charge underneath that, which is what's in fuzzy print, was in fact $510. It was also the case, and this is the rest of the fine print, that you had to take up a TPG home phone line rental for an additional $30 per month to get the $29.99 per month offer. So the total cost that the customer was exposed to was a lot more than the $29.99 per month. And the court said that in that scenario, the ad was misleading. So TPG defended it because they said, we gave them all the information that they needed, plus additional detail about those extra costs and obligations was disclosed once people started to sign up. That was all disclosed to them before they committed. That didn't save them either. What the court said was people will get a quick impression, $29.99 per month. That's not correct. This ad is misleading. So that was the point where they got the dominant impression. And none of those side arguments were enough to help TPG avoid liability. And so that's kind of the start point for starting to look at environmental claims. These ideas of dominant impression, how much are you using footnotes, what are you leaving out, you know, things like that. That's what you need to be thinking of as we approach these kinds of impact and environmental claims.
So we've talked about a few different aspects of the why, the how. Now we're going to talk a bit practically about the approach of what to do when you're trying to structure a claim and you have an environmental claim to make. And so the first step is to start with substantiation. And so that's to consider the nature and the quality of the substantiation you have for the claim at the outset. So at the beginning, when you're planning a campaign. Starting with this, rather than starting with the claim itself, is generally a good recipe for avoiding trouble. It's when you conceive a claim that you would like to be able to make and then try to retrofit the facts that it can start to create some problems in terms of substantiation. So at this point, you're considering what is the evidence or proof you're relying on to back up your claim, and being really specific in understanding the source, the methods for any calculations that you might have, what part of the product life cycle the evidence relates to, and what is the position for the rest of the supply chain or operations. So really understanding what you're relying on. Another important thing, and I think lawyers always love this, but it's a very good point, keep records and a paper trail of all sources supporting your claim. They should be up to date and reflect the data that's available. If the substantiation is weak or uncertain, seek better information at that early stage. So thinking about getting the most robust substantiation that you can. And then the second step, now that you've got your robust substantiation, is to match the claim to the substantiation you have. So tying the claim to the supporting data and not being tempted to overstate the environmental impact. So approaching it this way can avoid a mismatch between the substantiation and the claim. So for example, if you're considering a claim like we use organic ingredients as an overarching statement with nothing else, the question is, which ingredients are organic? Is it all of them? Is it some of them? Is that clear from the claim itself? So it's just about matching up specifically with the substantiation you have. So when you're thinking about the claim, think about things like not leaving out important information. So if the claim only relates to one part of the product or business, not using small print to vary the headline claim. So the headline claim itself should be tied to the substantiation. As we saw in the TPG case, you can't just put everything into the footnote or disclaimer and hope for the best. Another one to think about is to also consider how the imagery might affect the overall impression of an ad. So images of plants, animals, the earth, green and blue colors, these can be design elements that add to the impression of an environmental benefit. So think about the overall impression, including that imagery and graphics. The bottom line is that the marketing should reflect the work that's already happening in the business. So that's the decisions about materials, partnerships, supply chain, the operational work that comes first, which is the substantiation, and then the promoting that follows it. So if you think about it in that two-step process, substantiation, and then tailoring your claim to the substantiation, it's the best way to structure.
Yeah. And dealing with it at that conceptual point as well is a great way to kind of not get really heavily invested in a message or a particular theme for a campaign, only to find at the last stage that there are inherent problems with it that you have to unwind. So kind of looking at these things early is a really good way to reduce your risk and your time and operational risk as well as your legal risk. So those are some of the underlying principles. And a little recipe to think about as you're starting to think about how this applies to your own claims. Let's have a look at how this works with some common examples of types of claims which can comprise greenwashing. So the first one, and this is one that's been raised by both ASIC and the ACCC, is what they call vague claims. So, we see these tags on pretty much everything now in one form or another. This is eco-friendly, this is green, this is a sustainable choice, this product does not harm the environment. The problem with claims like this is mostly the risk arises when they're used in isolation without any additional explanation, because they could create a whole range of meanings to an ordinary, reasonable person seeing them. And you might only be able to substantiate one, or for businesses unlike us, none of the meanings that are implied. And so that's where you get that potential mismatch between your substantiation and your claim, which creates legal risk, like Danny was speaking about. So typically the recipe there is to add just a bit more information to explain what you mean when you say those words. It's not the case that you can't use them. It's just that it's much lower risk and frankly, much more impactful to a consumer making a choice to explain what you mean. So take a claim like, our products are safer for the environment, without any further explanation. Safer for the environment, the claim doesn't have a clear, consistent definition for the terms that they're using that would be understood by the general public. That could be open to such a wide range of interpretations. It's comparative, safer than what? That of itself creates a risk. What does safe even mean in that context? What is safety in the context of the environment? It's hard to understand exactly what the business is trying to say from that choice of words. And ultimately the risk is that the dominant message or the overall impression is that the products are safer or have a stronger environmental impact than what can actually be substantiated. Perhaps, what the business meant to say was, we've reduced our environmental impact by using GOTS certified organic cotton, or, adding a bit of detail about what you mean when you say you've improved your environmental impact, and avoiding words like safe, which are much harder to understand. That's typically the way to go about addressing a claim which is on its own vague. Add a bit more detail, explain what you mean. It's also important to detail the specific part of your product or process or service that the claim relates to. You know, another way vague claims can create risk is if, in fact, they only apply to a small part of your product or your packaging or whatever it might be, but that's not clear, that's left out when you make the headline claim. So, you know, it would be high risk to call a line of clothing sustainable, a la Kourtney Kardashian and Boohoo, without considering the whole of the product life cycle and the rest of the range which is available. You know, you need to think about raw materials, manufacturing, delivery, packaging, sale and disposal of the products when you're thinking about your claims. Because if you just focus in on one bit, the risk is that people think that it applies more widely than it actually does. The last point I'll make about vague claims is that they're quite pervasive in social media. And a lot of businesses ask us, well, do we still have to do it in social media? Because it's a bit hard, it looks a bit messy. Sadly, the answer is yes. Both the regulators, ACCC and ASIC, have been pretty clear that the fact that something is a small format ad or there's not room to add enough information to explain your claim is not a good excuse. And so in practice, what that means is sometimes you will come up with claims which aren't well suited to small format media, and maybe you just need to not put them there. You can also get creative with how you do it. Maybe there's extra information on someone's t-shirt. Maybe, you know, there are a range of ways to approach it, but the short point is that all of these rules apply equally on social media. And if you simply can't fit enough information to de-risk a claim, that's probably a bit of a red flag that maybe you need to rethink what claims you're making in what media formats.
The next one are absolute claims, data claims. And absolute claims like zero emissions or database claims, 50% recycled plastic, are extremely powerful. They are excellent messaging to put out to consumers. But the thing to be really careful of with these kinds of claims is to think about the substantiation that you have and whether it's sufficient to support the claim, because an absolute claim requires substantiation for it in its entirety. So, for example, if you claim your product or your service is free from something, consumers will naturally assume this means 100% free from that. If that's not accurate, and your product or the manufacturing process does actually take a small proportion of the material, component, or characteristic, you actually will need to change the claim from being absolute. An example would be, it would be misleading to claim that your garment is free from polyester and microfiber plastics if some components actually do contain these synthetics, for example, the thread or the fastenings. So it's important to think about the substantiation. Another thing is, if there's an absolute or database claim that applies only to a portion of the product, then that has to be clear. So if the plastic-free claim only applies to one part, then say so. So plastic-free bottle, plastic-free packaging, etc. So it's being clear and specific about the claim, thinking about that two-step process again. It's always important to be careful with claims of up to or starting from. A figure you choose to represent should be consistent with what typically happens rather than a minimum or maximum. So claims like this might need additional explanation or a full rethink depending on the context in which you're using them. And with database claims, such as we have reduced our waste production in this product from 68% to 5%, it's important to use an accepted form of calculation. Consider whether you're using assumptions, whether those are reasonable assumptions, and in some cases, you'll need to include information about the calculation and any assumptions in close proximity to the claim or make it available elsewhere so people can understand what the claim is based on. The next one that comes up quite often are claims about materials used in your products. And you should apply the same principles that we've already talked about at a high level. Ensure that you're not being inadvertently vague and try to be as specific as possible. So if you describe a material as sustainable, for example, sustainable bamboo, you need to signal why or how this is sustainable. You can't assume that people will know or have that extra knowledge that you might have from doing all the research into this product. So it's important to keep that in mind as well when you think about your reasonable audience and what information they know. So the basis for that claim might also vary depending on the approach you've taken. So explaining it and providing that little bit of extra detail will assist. When describing a product as having a particular quality, like being recyclable, compostable, or biodegradable, consider the following guidelines. Be clear on the amount of the product that is composed of those materials. For example, made from 25% recycled materials. If you're claiming that a product is compostable or recyclable, it should be capable of home recycling or composting unless it's clearly stated otherwise. So this is just being clear in the claim about what you mean by these terms. It's lower risk to explain what you mean by common terms, particularly where they don't have a fixed definition. So things like circular, natural, or present in nature. It's just that extra step of explaining what do you mean by the claims, that level of specificity to help people understand what the claim is saying.
Another big one, quite self-evidently, is carbon claims. So when I say carbon claims, I'm talking about net zero, carbon neutral, and claims along those lines. I suppose the short point here is that without any additional information or qualification, these kind of claims do risk being misleading, and they are under the scope of both regulators and activist groups at the moment, as we've seen. The risk is that consumers don't understand the scope or the nature of the claim, any qualifications or limitations around it, and the extent of the benefit that that claim is likely to actually produce in reality. So if you're intending to make these kinds of carbon or emissions claim, there are a few guidelines to follow. The first is that, and I think this is pretty obvious for the B Corp community, but I'll say it anyway, these claims need to be based on a really thorough baseline assessment using recognised methodologies, preferably by a reputable service provider who works in this field. It's also really important to be transparent about the inclusion and calculation of scope 2 and 3 emissions, because that's obviously a big one for a lot of businesses, and whether they're in or out, and whether it's disclosed that they're in or out, or how they're accounted for, can be a really easy way of inadvertently tripping into that area of being potentially misleading. It's also really important to be clear on the extent to which any claim relies on emission reductions activities versus purchased offsets, because they're quite different things. If your claim relies on offsets, it's also important to give an indication of the kind of offsets used, and as I said, the extent to which they're relied on. So that's obviously something that's in play in the Santos case, where they had this net zero 2040 plan, which relied heavily on offsets and questionable methodology offsets whilst they were ramping up fossil fuel activities. So, there is a potential for a real mismatch between the two. The language, the word neutral, assumes equivalency between the emission and the offset, and that creates an inherent level of risk. We'll get a bit more detail about how the courts regard that potential mismatch when there's an outcome to the Energy Australia claim. But in the meantime, our advice is that if you're making those kind of headline claims, you need to include some additional information to explain what's entailed or what sits behind it, including offsets, planning, etc. In terms of net zero claims, you also need to have a really clear plan with measurable and realistic milestones sitting behind it. You need to be tracking the milestones, and potentially reporting on them as well to avoid the claim being misleading. An aspirational claim, like a net zero claim, is perfectly okay so long as there's a realistic chance of you getting there. But if it is simply no more than aspiration, I'd love to be net zero by tomorrow. I don't think I am, but net zero by tomorrow, probably misleading because I don't actually have a plan to get there, and it's not a robust plan. So those are the things to think about in that context. Another thing that we've seen some businesses doing is making these claims just in respect of one product, one area of their business, etc., without disclosing the position for the rest of their business. And that of itself can create legal risk by omission. To say that just this small part of your business is doing great, is carbon neutral, has a net zero plan for next week, does risk being misleading if everything else you're doing is still really environmentally damaging and involves kind of increases to carbon emissions and things like that. So, you know, some businesses say things like, our offices are carbon neutrals. We have 7 trucks in our delivery fleet of 4,000, which are EVs. You know, transparency is the start point towards de-risking it, but it's not necessarily always the whole picture. So those kinds of areas are ones that you need to look at really carefully before you start making those kinds of claims. So what we've talked through so far is a bit of guidance on the kinds of claims, how to make claims and what to avoid when you're actually doing that kind of content conceptualizing process. I think it's also important to talk about the role for leadership in B Corp businesses when thinking about greenwashing risk. And as I said at the start, this kind of radical impact opportunity. You know, we've talked about the way to structure robust claims. I think there's also important to think about risk more widely. You know, the legal risk from contravention, reputational and brand risks for B Corps particularly, and operational risk arising from business interruption, time and cost involved in responding if there is an investigation. You know, there are a number of steps that leadership teams within a business can take to understand and mitigate those risks. First, the leadership team needs to be aware of the kind of comms that a business is making. You know, what's out there, websites, press releases, marketing, socials, other reporting. You know, do you really know what's out there? And have you done a stock take on your public climate and broader ESG type claims? We've seen ASIC pick up businesses for historical claims, which are still floating around. You know, it is important to undertake that process to make sure you're clear on what's out there. And have you formulated a plan to revise and de-risk claims where necessary? Next is to build a comms strategy which takes account of your business purpose, your risk appetite, and the impact that you're seeking. You know, legal risk analysis is a factor in that. You know, do you talk about your materials a lot? Do you talk about waste and circularity or carbon reduction or all of it? You know, be conscious of the risk of the particular kind of claims that are part of the story that your business tells. Once you've done that, then you can get radical. You know, consider how your comms strategy can have a broader positive impact, how you can educate people, how you can raise the bar in your industry for transparency and challenge your competitors to follow you. You know, that's cool. You can also advocate for change, seek out collaborators, you know, take a big picture view. All of those things become low risk legally and reputationally and much more appealing once you've got a really solid foundation of compliance from which to do it. A key piece of this and a key part of that kind of radical impact is around impact reporting. You know, regular, transparent reporting creates a process for regular review and reassessment internally of your impact claims for the purpose of producing those reports. So it's got a twofold benefit. First of all, it's forcing you to keep an eye on what your claims are and how you're measuring your impact and see if it's sufficiently robust on an internal basis. And then it allows you to tell your story to the world and produce change by doing so. You know, and that's a great way for B Corps to distinguish themselves based on accountability. I will flag though that impact reporting is also an area of business because businesses can inadvertently expose themselves to risk. I think there's a really strong desire to report kind of strong data-based claims and things like that, which sometimes don't have enough information around the assumptions that are used in making them, or present only one piece of a bigger picture. And so it is an area where you do need to be careful and take that kind of holistic view to what you're reporting and how. You know, the practical tips we've discussed will help reduce that risk. And you should get your impact reports checked by your legal team, to be frank, for those reasons. But moving back to kind of the bigger picture, you know, think about what compliance processes are in place to support compliance across the business more broadly. You know, which people need to know about the law and the risks, and have they been trained on it? What review processes do you use, and are they robust, including from an external communications marketing perspective, and also from a general supply chain and contracting perspective. Lastly, it's also relevant to consider your company's contracts and policies, you know, and in this regard, think about, what do your contracts and policies say about ESG issues and your company's purpose? You know, do you infuse your purpose up and down your supply chain by placing obligations on your partners? Because that's another way you can amplify your impact. You know, and if you can't answer those questions off the cuff, then you probably need to do a stock take of your contracts and policies and make sure they match your legal risk appetite and reflect your business's philosophy and purpose. And then coming back to how we can talk about it, you know, once you've done that, this is another tool, another piece of evidence and substantiation, another part of the story that you can tell the outside world about how your business operates and how other businesses can operate in a way which is better and more impactful. So it kind of all feeds back into this opportunity to create change, as well as just mitigating legal risk. You know, and that's what we love, and that's what B Corps are about fundamentally: transparency and trust. So we're close to the end. I know there's probably a few questions. We've covered a lot of territory. So before we go to questions, let me just zoom back and give you a couple of kind of takeaway points that I hope have hit home for you from the session. The first is that, yes, environmental claims do carry a particular risk in the current regulatory environment. You know, but don't be green hushed. You know, that's just as bad as greenwashing. You know, we do invite you to see this as an opportunity to make compliance part of your brand, to build consumer trust, and to share your business's story. And when we say that, you know, that there's a power in sharing your journey, you know, and perhaps even more so than trying to cultivate an image of perfection. I think from a consumer perspective, that's more meaningful, because we are essentially all imperfect people on our own journeys. And also from a regulatory perspective, the ACCC has itself recognised that businesses are on a journey and that they're free to promote that journey. The question is just that they don't go too far. Consider risk at the start of the claim or campaign development process. You know, don't bolt it on at the end. That's when you run into troubles and headaches, and the legal team doesn't get along well with the marketing team and the comms team. You know, follow the process of analysing your substantiation at the outset. That's how you build really robust claims and avoid being inadvertently misleading. Leadership should be looking at the bigger picture, matching operations, contracts, supply chain and policies to your purpose and your risk appetite as another way of enhancing your impact. And lastly, get help where you need it. You know, take calculated risks. Don't avoid risks altogether, because that's boring. And it's not part of how we as B Corps operate, because we want to create change. You know, push the envelope, be bold, be radical. That's how we change the world. Good legal advice will empower you in this way and not just be a handbrake, because lots of people don't like lawyers and see us as handbrakes, but it doesn't have to be that way. That's all from us. Should we throw it open to questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Hannah and Danny, for your expertise and guidance and practical tips, and really highlighting the opportunity and the power of B Corps to drive social change through their communications. And we do have a few questions, so I'll share those with you. Firstly, one that we've received from Cass is, how can an organisation ensure that they're not giving a false impression when it's subjective? We might think we're being clear, but it would take a lot of user research to determine how the message is perceived. So how much would be considered due diligence? So a little bit more depth in what that means.
Great question. Thank you, Cass. I suppose there's a couple of pieces to the answer to this question. First of all, you know, ultimately the end answer will be contextual to the kind of claim that you want to make. But I think the best way to address this is using that two-step process. So rather than thinking, I want to make this claim, and then trying to grab around for what you can to find to support it, and thinking about whether you need more research or do we have enough, is this safe? Think about what you do have access to, you know, what your business is doing, what information you've got about, you know, how your customers perceive your business and things like that. Start with that and see what you can do in terms of your claims from that, because then you won't hopefully find yourself in that position of having to scratch around for substantiation after you've derived the claim.
Great, thank you. I have a question, just building on that. So we've got a wide, diverse community of B Corps of different sizes and different scales, some of whom will have dedicated legal teams and others who won't necessarily have a law firm or a legal person in their team. So what advice do you have for our B Corps in when and how to engage the legal profession in the process of developing claims and campaigns?
Also a great question. Thanks, Angie. I think it starts with an initial risk analysis. So I think most businesses are probably perfectly able to look at a claim and play devil's advocate themselves and think about, is there a lot of risk here? Have we built this claim in a way that's robust? And does that match the risk associated with that claim match our risk appetite? And it's when you perceive a mismatch there, that's when you need to start speaking to some legal team. And sometimes it's the case that it can just be a bit of education and training at the outset, a little bit like what we've done today, then gives people enough information to be able to go out and work based on that, rather than having to, you know, it's not reasonable or likely that small businesses are going to have deeply entrenched, pervasive legal processes for every piece of marketing content. And it's frankly, it's not necessary because the risk is low for a lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I really liked what you said about using the power you have to influence your audiences, but also the impact you can have on your supply chains, and that can happen at any scale as well. So small scale and large. And I guess when thinking about the risks of our communication, it's also a good opportunity to test as well. And if you are in doubt, to seek advice. But you can test small and then grow from there. So you did talk a little bit about the concept of greenwashing greenwashing as well. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, like your perspective on the impact of that concept? I
think the impact of greenwashing, I think, comes back to what Danny spoke about in terms of how the IPCC sees the opportunity for responsible advertising to actually enhance and accelerate change and decarbonisation and environmental awareness. You know, if people aren't speaking for fear of repercussions, all of that opportunity is missed. And, you know, for B Corps, that's a huge missed opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things you talked about was aspirational claims. And Andrew's asked a question here, is whether you could speak a bit more to the risks that might arise around sharing your sustainability aspirations, like we want to improve or we want to be better at XYZ.
Yeah. It's so framed like that. It's typically reasonably low risk if you're just saying we want to improve, because there's no kind of underlying assumption about the existing state of affairs when you say that. But if you say we're going to improve, we're going to do this by this time, that's when you need the really robust plans in place to make sure that it's likely that you're going to get there. And so there are different levels of risk depending on how you phrase your aspirational claim.
Yeah, and we do see quite a lot of aspirational claims, which those visionary bold statements do drive people to be motivated to take action. But yeah, it's substantiating those when you're communicating them externally is pretty important.
Big opportunity as well. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think there's a big opportunity as well with aspirational claims to create a pattern and an expectation of transparency about the journey, you know, among industries and across different businesses, that it's okay to tell that story, because that's kind of the flip side of the aspirational claim, isn't it? We're not there yet. And, you know, we judge that we need to get better at this because we're not there yet. And, you know, that of itself is really powerful and a great way of trying to stimulate change.
Yeah, and I mean, we do talk about the B Corp certification platform being an opportunity to launch off that credibility and tell those stories about what you're not so good at as well, because you're coming from a base of trust and a base of strength as well. So the interesting stories are the ones that feature tension and conflict, and how you overcome those. So yeah, absolutely. Another question from Emma is, how, if you do spot greenwashing, like how do you go about reporting suspected claims by companies in Australia?
There are a few things you can do. You can always make a report to the relevant regulator, so the ACCC and things like that. You can make a complaint directly to the company. You can say, hey, this is wrong. Don't you want to fix it? Also, if you don't, we're going to tell the regulator. That's a process we use reasonably commonly, because then you can show the regulator their response and show that you've made an effort to resolve it without kind of taking up their resources. And you can test out whether there's a good reason or a good basis to the claim by engaging with the people making the claim first. If you do kind of get to the stage of making a complaint and you want to turn it into an advocacy piece, that's when you can start to kind of make the complaint and make it public. So you quite commonly see advocacy groups doing that. Complaints made against Shell, Ampol, high emission industries, high emission businesses. There's been a number of those recently where the advocacy group has made the complaint and they've published it and made it public and gotten some press around it too, to kind of build into their strategy. So you can be quite strategic about it. It is an opportunity. But if you're going to start pointing the finger, it's so important that you've checked everything of your own first.
Absolutely. And related to that is Gianna has a question around the guidelines from those regulators, and where best to access those. And I believe the answer is the website. I've seen the guides myself, but keen to see if you've got any other recommendations on where to go when you're looking for guidance on specific claims and regulations.
The ACCC and ASIC guides are the best start point, and you'll find them on their website. One of the challenges with this area of law is that there aren't specific black and white rules, and until there are court cases which deal with the different kinds of claims, we don't have a clear position on what's okay and what's not. It is judgment calls and application of the principles that we talked about, and that means it's always really context specific. So take guidance from these, from resources provided by industry groups like BLAB, the ACCC guides and the ASIC guides themselves. They don't always get the law right. They have to go to the court and say, this is what we think. Do you agree? And they do sometimes lose cases, but it gives you a good idea of what they're going to investigate and prosecute. So those are the best things to do. And then if you're still unsure, you should really get advice on the actual claims that you want to make, rather than trying to apply principles if you're feeling confused.
Yeah, great. And just one more question before we wrap up. You talked quite a bit about about examples of what not to do, and how to sort of work towards creating substantiated claims. Do you have any brands or organizations that you hold up of demonstrating what to do, like doing it well in terms of being compliant and driving social impact?
Oh gosh, I mean, every B Corp would be a great answer.
Great answer.
We've all been and no, I mean that. That's not, just pandering to my audience. Because we've been through the certification process, that's what the process, does, is it checks that businesses are operating the way they say they operate. And so for that reason, B Corps have this huge platform and these great stories to tell already. It's just avoiding inadvertent risk areas that is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So a huge thank you to both of you today for your generosity and your intelligence in sharing this with our community, and also offering to share this on an ongoing basis. This will be a super valuable resource for our community ongoing as more and more B Corps join the movement. We thank everyone for coming along, and planning to run more of these sort of educational sessions around storytelling in the B Corp world. So please reach out to me as well if you've got any suggestions or questions. And also reach out to Hannah and Danny if you're looking for further support on this topic. I'm sure they'll be willing to help. And if you'd like to look at other events that we've got coming up, we do have some more, including a roundtable for B Corps on social change and the role of business in social change, particularly around the context of the consideration of the Voice to Parliament referendum, which has just been announced for less than 6 weeks' time. So it's lots of good discussion to join there. So please come along to that session too. And our community Q&A coming up in September for any questions for the B-Lab team that you might have. So please join those. And otherwise, thanks all for coming. and have a great afternoon, and all the best with your storytelling.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.